G'day everyone, my name is Hoy, and in this video I'm going to show you how to use the dreaded curves in Photoshop. Now if you're anything like me, when you first saw curves or learnt about it, you probably got a little bit intimidated because there's so many switches and graphs that you don't really know what it all does. And if you were following along with the tutorial, you probably just followed along with the tutorial and then closed it as soon as you had the chance. So in this video, I'm going to go through all the switches, so by the end of the video you would be a master about curves, or at least not be as intimidated by it. So I'm going to go through what is a curve and when or why you want to use it, using some of these example pictures here, which you can also download in the link in the description below. Now there are two ways to create curves. One is through an adjustment and the other one is through an adjustment layer. Now I know it both sounds very similar, but they do have differences. So I'm just going to delete this adjustment layer here so we can start from the beginning and then create an adjustment, not an adjustment layer but an adjustment. So to do that, let's go to image and then go down to adjustment and go down to curves. Now you can see that the keyboard shortcut is Command or Control M. So let's click on that and this menu will come up. Now this is the curves here where you make the adjustments, and these are the options around it. Now I won't go through in this adjustment menu what it all does, etc. I will go through it in detail how it works on an adjustment layer. Now the beauty of this is that it does all the settings here replicated in the adjustment layer. So don't worry, I'm not skipping over all these functionality, but I just don't want to duplicate what I'm going to say for this and the adjustment layer. So what you saw me do quickly is just adjusted these curve here, or this graph here. So if I turn it off, so I'm just going to delete that curve here, and that's starting from the beginning. And I'm just going to make an adjustment here just so you can see it, and then press OK. Now this leads me to one of the key differences between an adjustment and an adjustment layer. You can see that although the changes that I've done to this image has been applied to this image, there's no way of me getting that back again, that curves again. So if I wanted to go back and edit it, because I've now figured that, you know what, it's a little bit too dark or a little bit too bright in some areas, I can't do it. I obviously can hit the undo button, the Command or Control Z, but that option is not always available. So for example, when you've already closed the image and then open back up, the undo option won't be there. So a way to get around that is to create this image as a smart object. So to do that, let's right click on the empty space here, not on the title or the thumbnail, and then select Convert to Smart Object. Once you've got that, go back to Image, Adjustment, and then Curves again. Now I can make these changes, whatever changes I want, and then press OK. Now don't worry, I will explain how all this works a bit later, but for the time being, all I want to show you is the effect of the smart object. So I'm going to press OK, and now if I wanted to change the settings of the curves, I can simply double click on the word curves here on the smart filter, and then I can adjust it. So that gives you some flexibility of using an adjustment with a smart object. Now even with the flexibility of a smart object, I actually don't prefer this. Now I'm not saying that this way is right or wrong. For me, there is no right or wrong. It's just different ways of working depending on what works for you and your workflow. Now, the reason why I don't prefer this is because this curve is applied to this one single layer. Now, there are times when I want that effect to apply to a whole bunch of layers, and I don't want to be manually creating or duplicating the same curves adjustment and then apply it to each individual layer. So if that didn't make sense, don't worry, I'm going to demonstrate what I mean. But for the time being, just know that you can adjust the curves by using a smart filter. Now, that's using the adjustment, not the adjustment layer technique. So let's show you the adjustment layer technique. So what I want to do now is just to revert back to the image that I had when I first opened it. Now, a quick way, instead of opening and closing or pressing undo a heap of time, is just pressing F12 on your keyboard, and that will revert it to when you last saved it or when you last opened it. So let's create a curves adjustment layer now. So there's a number of ways you can do that. You can go down to your adjustment panel here. If you don't see it, go to window and then just make sure that adjustments is selected, and then you can click on this icon here and that will create the curves adjustment layer. I'm just going to delete that and show you the alternative way, which is hitting this icon here and then just go down to curves. Now that will give you a similar graph here without all the other options surrounding the curves, and now I can simply make the same adjustment as I want. The beauty of this is that I can have this adjustment layer at my disposal, and if whenever I want to change anything, I can simply make this curves layer active or select it and then just make the changes. So I don't have to create a smart object, and smart objects actually increase the size of your file size. So if that's ever an issue for you, consider using an adjustment layer. Now this adjustment layer applies to everything underneath it. Now because we've only got one layer underneath it, you can't really see the effect. But let me create another layer by clicking on this new layer icon here. And actually what I wanted this layer to be is down here actually, but instead of doing that and clicking and dragging to this layer, I'm going to show you a shortcut, just a very quick shortcut. So I'm going to delete that and say that my active layer is here and I wanted to create a new layer below it instead of on top of it. What I can do is press Command or Control and then click on this new layer icon here, and that will produce a layer underneath the active layer. So here what I'm going to do is just going to paint something random. So I've got my brush tool, I press B on my keyboard. I might just change the color so you can see it, probably this lime green color, and then just paint some squiggly lines. Now this is random. Now what this adjustment layer is doing is applying this effect, whatever effect I had here, so I'm just going to exaggerate it a little bit more, to both these layers here. Now if I move this up, you can see that this layer, this curves layer, only applies to this background layer, not here. So the beauty of the adjustment layer is that if I have multiple layers that I want the same effect on, then all I have to do is put it underneath the curves layer. That's something that I can't do if I use the image adjustments and curves, because remember that only applies to a single layer. Okay, so let's move on to how the curves actually work. So I'm just going to trash this temporary layer and then click on this icon here, and I'm going to reset it by clicking on this icon here. Now you can see that this graph has a lot going on. First question you might ask is, well, what is all this? These what we call histogram here. The histogram is basically showing you where the pixels are in the image. And you might be wondering, what do you mean? To put it into context, if you look at the x-axis here, the horizontal axis here, you can see that there is black here that graduates to about mid-gray and then pure white here. So what it's saying here, this histogram, is that there is a lot of pixels here in this range of the shadows here. So you're going from 0, which is pure black, to a tonal value of 255, which is pure white. So there's a lot of shadows here at around about 20 tonal values. So there's a spike where this dark point is here. And then where the midtones are, there's less so here. And then towards the white, there is a little bit less white. And then pure white, there's a little bit of spike there. Now at the moment, our channel is on the RGB channel here. There are a few different options. We've got red, green and blue. Depending on whether your image is RGB or CMYK, you'll see different options here. This image is an RGB image, so therefore we've got red, green and blue options. Now we've got it selected on RGB, which is the composite of all these channels. Now a little bit about color theory is that when you combine all these channels, all the red, green and blue, all we're affecting is the luminance or the brightness of that channel. So by clicking and dragging this up or down, we're adjusting the brightness of the image. Whereas if you've selected a color as the channel, say red, you're actually injecting more of that red or less of that red and more of the complementary color. I'm going to go through what the complementary colors are a little bit later, but for the time being, just know that, you know, if you go to the color channels, you're just affecting the color more so than the brightness of it, right? So blue, click and drag up and down. I'm just going to reset that and it returns me back to the RGB channel. Now I'm just going to move this diagonal line so you can see the trend line here. So if I move it up above this trend line, that means that it's going to make the image brighter. If I click and drag it down to below this trend line here, it's going to make it darker. Now where you click on this is important, because I'm just going to remove that and reset it from the beginning. So where along the x-axis that you click on does influence where it gets darker or brighter. So what do I mean by that? So if I select something along here, for example, what I'm selecting is a tonal value of 24, which is the dark areas. So if I move this up, the dark areas will be brighter. And if I move this down, the dark areas will be lighter. Now, conversely, if I select this bit, what I'm selecting is the tonal range of this value here. So if I click on it, I can see that I'm selecting the tonal range of 229. And remember, the total tonal values are 255. So what I'm saying is that at a tonal, any pixels with a tonal value of 229, make it brighter or darker. So where you click along the curve makes a difference. So let's just reset it. I'm just clicking and dragging it outside and the graph snaps back to default. So if I want to make the shadows darker, all I can do is go down to make it darker, and then because it also affects the rest of the curve, and just say I don't want to affect the rest of the curve, I'm going to make a point here, click and drag to bring this back up. So what that means is that any point from here, from 119, will be basically following the default curve here. And you can make any sort of changes that you want, as you can see. So now let's talk about, well, what is the y-axis doing? So what we're doing is saying that if I select this point here, I'm selecting a value of 43. So remember, 43 is closer to black or the shadow areas than it is to the white. And what I'm going to do is increase it, right? So here I'm saying my selection wasn't that great when I've dragged it up, so I've changed 43 to 39. But what I'm saying is that whatever the original tonal value of 39 is, now make it 60. As in, make it brighter, because the higher value you are, the brighter it will get. And that's all it's saying. So if I make it darker, it's saying, okay, whatever the original 39 value is, the tonal value of 39, make it 29 now. So that's why you see the image getting darker. So this is the input, that is the original tonal value, and this is the output. The y-axis is the output, is, well, what do you want to change it to? So just to cement that a little bit more, I can make another stop here. So click, and I'm saying that pick out all the tonal value in this image that is 231, and then change it and make it darker to make it 169. So the lower you go, the darker the image will be. Now you saw that when I originally clicked on the value here, I had a certain number, 222 in this case. Now when I moved it, I can't move it exactly vertically. It takes a lot of control to move it vertically with my mouse. So if you ever want to make a very precise adjustment, what you can do is just select the point that you want to change, and then just use your up and down cursor keys, and then just increase it or decrease it. Now I've got my finger on the down cursor key, and that moves it by 1 increments. If you want to move it faster, you can press Shift and the up or down arrow keys to move it in 10 increments. So while we're talking about keyboard shortcut, the other keyboard shortcut is if you want to toggle through all the stops via the keyboard instead of your mouse, you can press plus to go to the next stop. So I'm just pressing plus on my keyboard, and if you want to go backwards, you can press minus on your keyboard, and then you can adjust it, as I said, with your keyboard again. If you made a mistake, there is a couple of ways to delete that. You can obviously click on it and then press delete, and that will delete that point, or you can click and drag it off the graph, and that graph will snap to the default position, and then you can release your mouse once you're outside this graph area. The other way is also you can press Command or Control and then click on that, and that will make that disappear. But just say you've got so many points along the curve and you don't want to individually delete the points, you can just press this master button, which is the reset button, and then that will take care of it. Now that's the technical explanation of how the curves work. I will go over these buttons later, but for the time being, the question is, well, why do we want to use it? Now, as I mentioned, curves, you can change the brightness values of your image, or you can change the color of your image. And you might want to do that because you're working on a composite and you want to match the color of your image with your background, or you want to stylize your image and make it your own, or you want to remove a color cast. Now, what I'm going to show you here with this particular image is just to add some warmth to this image here, because it does look a little bit too blue and purplish. I want to bring in a little bit of warmth, and for that, I'm going to bring in some orangey color here. So remember, the channel that we're on here is RGB, which adjusts the brightness of the image here, not the color. So to adjust the color, I have to go through these color channels here. Now, orange, if you're not aware, is made out of red and yellow. Now, the good news is that we have a red channel here. The bad news is we don't have a yellow channel here. So the question is, what do we do here? Now, to answer that, we need to know a little bit about color. So I'm going to go to my pre-prepared color wheel here and just give you a quick walkthrough of the color wheel. And the reason why I'm showing you this is to show you the opposite colors of these primary colors. So the opposite of red is cyan. The opposite of green is magenta. The opposite of blue is yellow. So if you picked it up, this is CMY, cyan, magenta, yellow. And as I mentioned, orange is here. So we need to add red, and then we need to add yellow. But as I mentioned, yellow doesn't show up in the curves adjustment. Well, not in this image because it's an RGB image here. So to get yellow from the curves adjustment layer, we need to use blue and use the inverse of blue. And that's what we mean by the opposite color. So if I use the inverse of blue, I get yellow. So let's just see how that works. So let's go back to our original color. Let's go to our red channel. And because I want red, I'm just going to do a basic mid-tone adjustment here and click and drag up. And by clicking on the mid-tone area, it's just saying that the whole picture is affected evenly. I could have said I want more red in the shadows. Remember that this dot here corresponds with this tonal value here, which is 23. Now what we need to do now is add the yellow. Remember, we don't have yellow here because we're working with an RGB image, but we have blue. And what we can do is use blue and take the inverse of blue to get yellow. How do we get the inverse of blue? Well, instead of clicking and dragging up, we actually drag down. And what that does is removes blue but adds the complementary color. The complementary color of blue is yellow. So I can exaggerate that effect, and you can start to see the yellow is being pushed into the image here. So I'm going to start off with something like this and perhaps go back to my red channel and just increase my red here. So something like this, maybe a little bit more just to exaggerate the effect. Now the contrast is a little bit too much for my liking, so I'm going to adjust my brightness level. So remember, I need to go to my composite channel, which is the RGB channel, and then I might just reduce or increase the brightness in the shadow area here. I might just increase it here and then just decrease the contrast by clicking on here, and then maybe just increase it about here. Now that might be a little bit too much, and the beauty of this thing is that you can always adjust it to your liking, so it's not set in stone. Now if you want to preview this before and after, you can click on this icon here. If you click and hold, you can see the previous image. When I let go of the mouse, I can see the changes here. So that gives a little bit of warmth to the image here. Now you can also turn off the visibility of the changes here by clicking on this eyeball here, and that's just exactly the same as if you were to turn off the visibility of this layer here. I've made a very basic change to this image here, but you can see how powerful curves is. Just by a few clicks of the mouse, I've changed this rather cold image here to a little bit more warmth. Now you can see that the adjustment layer has also got a built-in mask layer here. So if I didn't want the orange in the sky here, I can just mask that out. Now this is just a normal mask, so I'm going to click on it to make it active. I know that is active because of these white brackets around the rectangle here. I'm going to press B on my keyboard to invoke the brush tool. Make sure that I've got black as my foreground color, and then I'm just going to paint that out wherever I don't want the effect. So, the curves adjustment layer can work with your existing tools, and that's what makes it so powerful. Now, at the beginning of this video, I did say I will walk through the options that comes with curves, like all these areas here. So instead of using the adjustment curves, I'm going to show you how to bring that up with my adjustment layer. So click on this hamburger menu here, and you can go to curves display options here. So some of the options here is whether you want to show it in the light mode, which is like the RGB mode, and the other one is kind of like a CMYK viewing mode, which is like for print. The channel overlays is if you click this on and off, you can see that the red channels and the blue channels disappear as I toggle that on or off. The histogram, remember, is this gray area here, so turning it on and off here. And the baseline is this diagonal line here, which you can just see. And then the intersection is basically the grid lines for your active point here. So you can just barely see this horizontal line here, and you probably can't see the vertical line here. How dense the grid lines are here is controlled by these toggle switches here. So I'm not going to make a change. I'm going to press OK. We can also press cancel because we didn't make any changes. Now the other thing that I want to show you with curves is to remove color cast. So I've got another image here, and this image you can also download it from the link in the description below. Here you can see that it's a little bit, they've got a little bit of color cast here. Now, if you're like me, when I first began my Photoshop journey, I used to follow tutorials, and they would say, you know, look at this picture. It's got this color cast, that color cast. And I'm looking at it thinking, I cannot see any color cast. Not that I'm colorblind, but I just wasn't used to seeing what a color cast was. Thankfully, with more experience in Photoshop and photos in general, I can now see the color cast. But if you're like me, when I first started, you can't see the color cast. There's two ways to see whether an image has a color cast. Well, there's a lot of ways, but I'm just going to show you just two ways to pick out if there's any color cast here. So the first way is getting my eyedropper tool here, and I'm going to press I on my keyboard to invoke my color eyedropper tool, I should say. And then I'm going to select or open or activate my info panel here. Now, because I use my info panel quite often, it's already here. If you don't have it or you don't see it, go to Window and just make sure that info is selected. The name of the game here is just to look at your image and look at which part of the image should be mid-gray, or got a tonal value of 128. Now, this is just an eyeball check, right? So it's not going to be perfect. So somewhere along the concrete here, something like this. And while I've got my eyedropper tool selected, well, not selected, hover over the mid-gray point here, I'm just looking at my RGB values here. And I'm just looking at an area where it's kind of around 128. Now you can see at the moment I've got my red at 128, my green there or thereabouts at 137, but then you can see the blue at 155. So in this photo, I know that when my red and green channels are selected, there is more bias towards blue because I've got a blue value of 155. So intuitively, or just a gut instinct, there is a blue bias here. But if you don't like this technique, this quick and dirty technique, there is a little bit better visualization technique here. So to do that, just make sure that your layer is active. Go to Filter, Blur, and then Average. And what this does, I'll just close this. What this does is reduces all the colors, average all the colors into one color, and you can see here that it does have a bias towards blue. It's not pure blue. It's got a, I don't know what this color is, but it's got a murky bluish tinge to it. So we know just by visualizing it, they've got a blue bias here. Now, the problem with what I've just showed you is I've destructively turned my background image into this color here. So I've only did that just to demonstrate how you can pick out the color cast. I don't want this, so I'm just going to undo that by pressing Command or Control Z, and that will just undo that. So what has this got to do with curves? As I mentioned, with the use of curves, you can remove or adjust the color cast. So let's just show you how that's done. So I'm just going to create a curves adjustment layer, and then there are a couple of ways to do that. One is the manual way, and then the automatic way. So let me show you the manual way first. There are a few eyedroppers here. This represents the darks, the midtones, and the whites, the highlights. So what the name of the game is here is to click on the dark one and then just choose a dark area, an area that you think should represent the dark. Now before I click on it, I've got a sample size of 3 by 3, and what that means is that at the point where I click, it's going to sample a size of 3 pixels wide by 3 pixels high, and then takes the average of that and uses that as the dark point. So the bigger the area, the more it would sample. 3 by 3 is good for me. I'm just going to click on this, and that looks a little bit better, but it's very contrasty. But it's okay because we haven't done the gray point yet. So let's click on this second eyedropper here, which represents the midtones, and it's something like this that will give us the midtones. and then click on the white point eyedropper, and then I think it's something like this. Now the beauty of this is that there is no right or wrong. It's not like once you click on an area, that's it, you're locked in. If I don't like this kind of white, I can continue to click until I get the right style that I'm looking for. Now that applies to all these other eyedroppers as well. This photo is probably removed the color cast, so if I turn off this adjustment, you can see that it's very blue, and now the color cast is gone. Now it's very contrasty, and remember, if you want to continue to adjust it, go to our composite channel, which is the RGB channel. Remember, that controls the brightness instead of the colors, and what we can do is just increase this stop here, maybe decrease it down there. And just a reminder, remember, if I click on that, what we're saying is that any pixels that has a tonal range or tonal value of 0, any pixels that is black, now make it to a tonal value of 30, make it lighter. That's all it's saying. And then conversely, if I click on that, any value that is bright white, 255, make it slightly darker, 225. Now that is a quick way of removing color cast. Now if you don't want to just rely on your eye to see what the dark points and the light point is, there is a more scientific way. Not that it's better, it's just more scientific. You still, I would suggest, need to apply your own style, own artistic lens to it. So let me show you how that is done. So I'm just going to reset it. So who can remember how to reset it? If you've said click on this button, congratulations, you've been listening. Now to find the black point, what I can do is with this slider here, press Option or Alt on my keyboard, click and drag until you see the black points here. Now the areas that turn black first shows the darkest areas. So if I go along, more and more things are becoming darker. So if I go all the way back and just do it again, what I'm trying to do is look out for the areas that are turning black first, because that's the darkest areas. So somewhere like here is the darkest point. So what I can do, instead of just remembering where that point is, I'm going to select this, click and hold, and then select my color sampler tool here, and then click once here, and that will make the point here. I'm going to reset this and then do the same thing for my white point. Press Option or Alt on my keyboard and then just click there. Everything will turn black, and then slide it to the left, and then the first area that turns white is your whitest point. So the graffiti on the wall seems like it's a good point. Something like this will do. So this is my darkest point, this is my white point. Now to get the mid-gray point is a little bit more complicated, but is pretty easy. So let's reset this back to where it was, and I'm just going to disable this for the sec, and then I'm going to create a solid color. Now the color that I want is the mid-gray point, right? So the hex code is 808080, or you could have pressed or typed in 0 for your hue, 0 for your saturation, and then 50% for your brightness. I'm going to press OK, change the blend mode from normal to difference, and then I'm going to create a threshold adjustment layer. So what this threshold adjustment layer is doing is converting anything to the left of the image to black and anything to the right of it to white. Now you can see here all the pixels are to the left of this, so that's why you see a black image here. So what we want to do is click and drag it all the way to the left, and then slowly click and drag until you see the black points. Now what the black points signifies is the 50% gray point. So something like here is the mid gray point here, or the 50% gray. Now we can click to make a point here just to signify that this is our mid gray point here. Now these are what we call check layers. I only created it just to have this effect. I don't need it now, but instead of deleting it, I'm just going to undo that. I'm going to turn back on my curves adjustment layer here, and then I'm just going to do the same here. So I'm going to use my black point eyedropper, and remember this is my black point here, and then this is my gray point here, which was this point here, and then this is my white point or my highlight, which is here. Now you can see this is more scientifically correct in terms of finding out the dark points, light point, and then the 50% gray. But whether it suits your artistic style, you might need to make further adjustments, which is why I say, even though this method is more, I guess, scientifically correct, instead of just using your eyeballs to guess where all these tonal ranges are, it's not the be all end all. Now, I did mention that there is an automatic way of color correcting this as well. So let's just show you that. Let's reset this. And before we go on, you're probably bothered by these little sampling rings here. So I haven't forgotten about it. There are two ways to clear it out. Press Option or Alt and Shift, and that will change your cursor into this scissors here. And then you can just click, and that will make that disappear. Now, if you so happen to have lots of these sampling rings, you might not want to do that individually for, the dozens or however many sampling rings you have. So to clear that all in one fell swoop, you can go back to your eyedropper tool here. Just make sure that your color sampler tool is selected, and when you do have it selected, there is a clear all, and you click on that, and everything is right in the world now. So let's just collapse that, and let's just go through the auto option. Now, obviously there's an auto button here, and you can simply click on it. So what the auto option does is basically uses a certain algorithm and then adjusts the curves. So based on the algorithm, the default algorithm that my settings have got in Photoshop, it's determined that this is the right adjustment for us. It may not be what you're looking for, so you can adjust this. I'm just going to reset that again, and if you press Alt or Option and then click on your auto, then these options will come out. Now, the algorithm that it used to apply what we've just did was enhance brightness and contrast. Now, there are three other algorithms. You can just cycle through them and then see what you like. Now, I usually find dark and light colors to work well. Now, I've got another tutorial that goes into how these algorithms work in a little bit more depth. I won't go through it here, so for the time being, just cycle through them to see which ones you like. This still has a little bit of color cast in here, so for this option, find dark and light colors, there is an option to snap neutral midtones, basically to adjust the midtones so the midtones are more neutral. So if you're still not happy with that, you can still adjust the shadows, midtones, and highlights. That's similar to picking out your dark, middle, and light areas here. So if I click on that, I can click on this man's sweater, and you can see that the color that I've chosen is white. I didn't deliberately do that, but I'm going to pretend I deliberately do that. Now, the reason why I'm leaving it in here is because you might have also had this problem. The reason why it's white is because I've got my layer mask selected. Now, obviously, I can go cancel, and then select my curves thumbnails here and then do it again, but that's a lot of steps. If you ever find yourself in this situation, what you can do is press Command and then click on this, and then that will select the actual color instead of selecting the white of the mask. So I'm not happy with that, so what I can do, instead of just clicking on the image endlessly, I can say I can use this color and then just adjust it on the color picker. I can press OK, click on the midtones, and I'm going to go Command or Control on my keyboard, click somewhere on the concrete here. That's selected this color here, and then the highlights, just going to move out the way and press, remember, Command or Control, and then just click on that, and you can see that it's not pure white here, so I'm okay with that. Or you can, if you're not okay with that, you can always adjust it on the color picker. So I can click OK, the clip value is basically your limit. So again, I've got a more detailed video on how all these work, but for the time being, I'm going to accept the default values and then press OK. So when I press OK, it's going to ask me, do I want to use the settings that I've just did as my default? For most of the time, you're going to press no, because every time you press auto, it's going to use the same settings that you just applied. And I'm assuming that you don't want to apply that setting every time you press on this auto button here. So I'm going to press no for that. And so here is our adjustment. Now the contrast is not quite high, so I can continue to adjust it using the curves by moving this across. Now if you've forgotten how this works again, it's just saying that all the tonal ranges from 27 will be black now. So instead of being a little bit light, be 100% black. So I can do that for this bit as well, just to see how I would like it. So something like this will do. Now the one last feature that I want to show you is this on image adjustment tool. What this does is, instead of you trying to figure out what color it is, you can simply click on this and then click and then go up to make it brighter, go down to make it darker, and that automatically selects where the tonal range is depending on what you've selected. So how is that useful? So if I go on to the red channel and I click on here, when I first started, and I always go back to when I first started, I had no idea whether this is the midtone or the highlights or the shadows. I know that sounds very basic, but hey, I had no clue when I first started out in Photoshop, so I don't want to pretend that I knew everything even before I started Photoshop. So this tool really helped me out, and what I wanted to do was, for example, if I just wanted to add more red into this color value here, it automatically picks out what the color values are. So I'm not guessing, is it here? Is it there? I don't know. Is it here? Is it there? So it just takes out the guesswork if you don't know where in the tonal range it lies. So that's how you use curves in Photoshop. Now let's just go over what we've learned so far. So what we've learned is that Photoshop curves is not as scary as it looks. It's just a bunch of points that you click and drag onto this graph, and then you can adjust the brightness and the color range of your image. And the reason why you want to do that might be because you want to stylize your image, you want to remove a color cast, or you want to match the color of your image to another image because you're making a composite. Now we also learned a little bit about color theory. We saw this RGB color wheel and what the complementary colors are, and that helped us get colors where we don't see the corresponding colors in these channels here. We also learned how to remove color cast using curves. We went through just an eyeball method by selecting these points here, just using our eyes to estimate where the dark, light and midpoint grays are, and then we did a little bit more scientific method, and then we used the auto option. Now that's a beginner's run through of what curves are. It does have a lot of applications and it's very powerful. So if you learned something new, please like, subscribe, comment and hit the bell icon so you can get notified for when my next video is out.